Namaste, everyone. Welcome to Bharatiya Darshanik Manch.
Namaste.
Today, we are going to discuss Western philosophy. Okay, let's dive straight in.
Sounds good.
It's generally understood that the history of Western philosophy, like the actual record-keeping of it, really starts to get systematic with Aristotle.
Right. Not that people weren't thinking philosophically before him, of course.
Exactly. But he was really the first we know of who sat down and systematically looked at, wrote about, and critiqued the thinkers who came before him.
Precisely. His metaphysics, especially those first books, are just invaluable for us. He's kind of our main source, our lens for that whole early period.
He covers everyone from, say, Pythagoras and Thales right up to his own teacher, Plato, who he studied with for, 2 decades?
Yeah, a long time. So Aristotle gives us summaries, critiques. He's really shaping our view of how it all began. His work is, fundamental for understanding this early stage.
And he gives us this really helpful framework to understand these early thinkers, his idea of the 4 causes.
Ah, yes, the 4 causes. Crucial to Aristotle's own thought, but also how he analyzes others.
Yeah, he thought that to really get something, you needed to understand its why from 4 different angles. Remember that risotto example we talked about?
The risotto, perfect.
Oh.
Yeah, so the material cause.
That's just the stuff, right? The ingredients,
No.
rice, broth, parmesan.
Exactly. Then the efficient cause, that's the chef, the person or thing that actually makes it happen.
Yeah, right. Then the formal cause.
That's the recipe, the plan, the structure, the form it takes.
Okay, recipe. And finally, the final cause.
The purpose. Why make the risotto in the first place? For satisfaction, for a good meal. The end goal. Telos, as he'd call it.
Right, the telos. So Aristotle used this framework to look back at earlier philosophers.
He did. He was basically asking, okay, which of these causes were they focused on? Even if they didn't use his exact terms,
So that's our mission for this deep dive then, to trace those beginnings through Aristotle's eyes and see how these first philosophers tackled these big causal questions.
That's the plan. See how they approached the why of the world.
Okay, so where do we start? Aristotle points to the Milesians first, right? On the Greek coast of Asia Minor.
Yes, the Milesians, thinkers like Thales, Anaximenes. According to Aristotle, their main focus was squarely on the material cause.
The stuff. So their big question was basically, what's the world made of?
Pretty much, what's the fundamental ingredient? Is it water, air, something else?
And Thales famously said, water, right?
Water, yes. Water is the first principle of everything. That's one key statement attributed to him. Another fascinating one is all things are full of gods.
All things are full of gods. That really shows how fuzzy the lines were back then, doesn't it? Between science and, religion or metaphysics.
Absolutely. Was he talking literally about gods and everything, or more like an animating principle,
Yeah.
a sort of proto-scientific idea of inherent life or force? It's hard to say definitively.
And Thales wasn't just sitting around theorizing, was he? He was involved in practical stuff too, geometry.
Oh, definitely. He's credited with proving several geometric theorems, like the one about inscribing a right-angled triangle in a circle. Apparently, he sacrificed an ox when he figured that out.
An ox. Wow, he must have been pretty pleased with himself.
You'd think so. And he used geometry practically measuring pyramids by their shadows, figuring out how far away ships were at sea. It's this neat blend of abstract thinking and, real-world application.
A philosopher engineer, almost.
Yeah.
And the astronomy stuff. Predicting that eclipse in 585 BC, that's amazing.
It really is. Plus, figuring out the year was 365 days, identifying solstices, studying stars. He was clearly a keen observer of the natural world.
There's even that story Aristotle tells about him cornering the olive oil market using his weather knowledge.
Right. Just to show philosophers could make money if they wanted to, Aristotle says. He was a multi-talented guy.
But then there's the other side, the absent-minded professor image, falling into a well while stargazing.
Yes. Plato tells that one. The Thracian servant girl laughing at him because he's so busy looking up he doesn't see what's at his feet. It captures that stereotype perfectly.
He was one of the 7 sages, though, known for practical wisdom, too. Any other sayings?
A few aphorisms survive. Apparently, he wasn't too keen on getting married or having kids, thought it was a distraction.
Fair enough. So, back to the water idea. How did Aristotle critique it?
Well, Aristotle, always logical, pointed out a problem. If the earth rests on water, like Thales supposedly said, well, what does the water rest on?
Ah, right. It just pushes the problem back. Infinite regress.
Exactly. You need a more fundamental explanation, Aristotle thought. Thales identified the material cause as important, but his specific answer wasn't quite satisfactory for Aristotle.
Okay, so after Thales, in that Milesian school, we get Anaximander.
Yes, Anaximander of Miletus, probably Thales' student. He actually wrote a book on nature, apparently in prose, which was a big deal then.
And he was also into practical science and tech.
Very much so. Credited with the first world map, first star chart, first Greek sundial, even a type of indoor clock. Impressive stuff.
Wow. And his idea of the cosmos was quite different from Thales, wasn't it? No water needed.
Totally different. He pictured the Earth as a cylinder just hanging freely in space, not floating on anything. It stayed put because it was equidistant from everything else, balanced.
A free-floating cylinder. And the sun and moon.
Get this, he thought they were like giant wheels or tires of fire surrounding the Earth. We only see the fire through little holes or openings in the tires.
So fiery tires with holes. That's imaginative.
And eclipses or moon phases happened when these holes got blocked up somehow. It's a really ingenious mechanical model, considering the lack of tools.
And didn't he have some wild ideas about the early Earth and where humans came from?
He did. He thought the early Earth was surrounded by a sphere of fire, which then broke up into those fiery tires. And for humans, he used an analogy, like trees shedding bark. He suggested the first humans grew inside fish-like creatures in the water, protected by prickly bark. When they were mature enough, they shed the bark and came onto land.
Inside fish, with prickly bark.
Yeah. It led him to advise against eating fish, apparently since they were our ancestors. It's a fascinating sort of proto-evolutionary idea. Very out there for the time.
Truly remarkable. So how did his core idea differ from Thales, apart from the Earth not needing support?
The big difference was the fundamental substance. Anaximander rejected water, fire, air, any specific element. He proposed something more abstract.
The apeiron.
The apeiron.
The boundless, the unlimited, the undefined.
He figured if the basic stuff was, say, water, eventually everything would just become water, or be destroyed by its opposite, like fire. So the fundamental stuff had to be neutral, undefined, capable of becoming all the different things we see. This apeiron was the source everything came from and returned to. Aristotle later picked up on this, developing his idea of prime matter.
The boundless. That feels like a real step towards abstraction in philosophy.
It does. And he didn't just talk about the stuff, but also the forces. He saw the world as this interplay of opposites, hot and cold, wet and dry.
Like a cosmic balancing act?
Exactly. Constantly encroaching on each other, but always forced back into balance. There's a surviving fragment where he talks about them paying penalty and reparation to each other for their injustice, according to the ordering of time.
Wow. Penalty and reparation, almost like a system of cosmic justice holding things together.
It's a really powerful image of dynamic equilibrium. Very sophisticated for that early stage.
So who rounds out this Milesian trio?
That would be Anaximenes, a bit younger than Anaximander. He kind of circled back to some of Thales' way of thinking in a way.
How so?
Well, he went back to proposing a single specific element as the source of everything. And he also thought the Earth rested on something.
Okay, so not the apeiron. What was his element?
Air. Anaximenes thought air was the fundamental substance.
Air. Interesting. And what did the Earth rest on, if not water?
Air. He thought the Earth was flat, like a lid or a tabletop, and it floated or rested on the air beneath it.
A flat Earth floating on air, and the sun and stars.
Also flat. And they didn't go under the Earth, he thought, but circled around it horizontally, kind of like a hat turning on your head, maybe disappearing behind distant mountains.
Like a hat on a head. Okay. So how did he explain sunrise and sunset?
He suggested the flat Earth tilted slightly, causing them to rise and set relative to us.
And how did he explain air turning into other things, like water or earth?
Through condensation and rarefaction. It was actually quite clever. He said when air gets thinner, more rarefied, like by heat, it becomes fire.
Okay.
And when it gets denser, compressed, it becomes wind, then clouds, then water, then earth, then even stone. So different densities of air account for all the different states of matter.
Condensation and rarefaction, that's a pretty intuitive physical mechanism.
It is a very early attempt to explain material transformation based on a single substance and observable processes.
So the Milesians were really digging into that material called, what's it all made of? Water, the boundless air. But Aristotle points to another group over in Italy with a totally different focus, right? The Pythagoreans.
Exactly. Around Pythagoras, they shifted the focus dramatically towards the formal cause.
The formal cause. So the recipe, the structure.
Precisely. They weren't so much interested in the ingredients of the universe as they were in its underlying mathematical structure, the numbers in the recipe, you could say.
Numbers. So they thought math was the key to everything.
That seems to be the core idea. Aristotle reports they believed the elements of numbers were the elements of all things. They literally thought the heavens were a kind of musical scale, a harmony based on numbers.
A musical scale. Where did they get that idea?
The big inspiration seems to have been music itself, specifically the lyre. They discovered that musical intervals like an octave, a fifth, a fourth, corresponded to simple numerical ratios of the lengths of the vibrating strings.
Ah, the physics of music.
Exactly. And they took this observation and ran with it, generalizing it to the whole cosmos.
Yeah.
They figured if musical harmony depends on numbers, maybe everything does. All the qualitative differences we see in the world might just boil down to underlying quantitative, numerical differences in proportions.
That's a huge leap. So Aristotle saw them as investigating the formal cause, the mathematical pattern of reality.
That's how he framed it. They were looking for the structure, the form expressed in numbers.
And the community they formed in Croton, it was pretty unique, wasn't it? Almost like a prototype for later schools.
Definitely. It had elements you see later in Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum, but also maybe more like a religious order in some ways. They apparently held property in common, followed strict rules.
Rules about what?
All sorts of things. Periods of silence, specific ways to hunt or bread, rules about stirring the fire, even which shoe to put on first. Seems like a very disciplined, almost ritualistic way of life aimed at purification, both intellectual and spiritual.
That sounds intense. And they had dietary rules too, right? Something about beans.
Ah, yes. The infamous bean prohibition. Don't eat beans. It's one of the most talked about Pythagorean rules.
Why no beans?
Well, it's tied into their other beliefs, particularly metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls.
Right. The idea that souls move from body to body after death.
Exactly. Pythagoras taught the soul was immortal and could inhabit humans, animals, maybe even plants. Some later Pythagoreans even developed this idea of a huge cosmic cycle, like 3,000 years long, before a soul returned to a human form.
Wow. So how do beans fit in?
The connection isn't totally clear. Some ancient sources suggest beings were linked to reincarnation, maybe souls resided in them or they resemble human parts. There are also theories about favism, the genetic condition made worse by beans, or even flatulence being disruptive to meditative thought. But it was definitely a serious rule for them, tied to their views on the soul.
Soul migration, cosmic cycles, no beans. Definitely a different vibe from the Milesians talking about water and air.
Worlds apart, really. Much more mystical and, well, mathematical.
And Pythagoras himself. He became quite a figure after he died, didn't he?
Oh, massively so. His followers started treating him as more than human. There were stories about him having second sight, being able to be in two places at once by location, having a golden thigh.
A golden thigh, seriously.
Seriously. Some even said he was the son of Apollo. He became this semi-divine figure.
And that phrase, ipse dixit?
He himself said it. That comes from the Pythagoreans. It meant that if Pythagoras had said something, that was the final word, no argument needed. It shows the incredible authority he held, even posthumously.
So a stark contrast. Milesians focusing on the material what, Pythagoreans on the formal how, the mathematical structure. Where did Aristotle see his own teacher, Plato and Socrates, fitting in?
Well, Aristotle gives Socrates credit for a major shift. He says Socrates basically turned philosophy away from speculating about the natural world, the cosmos.
Like the Milesians and Pythagoreans were doing.
Right, and focused instead on ethics, on questions about virtue, justice, how people should live, a turn towards human concerns.
Okay, so Socrates brings in the ethical dimension. What about Plato?
Plato, according to Aristotle, tried to bring it all together. He attempted a grand synthesis, incorporating insights from both traditions, the Milesian interest in the physical world and the Pythagorean focus on form and structure.
And that synthesis was his theory of forms, or ideas.
Exactly. Plato proposed this whole other realm of perfect, unchanging forms, the form of beauty, the form of justice, the form of tableness, and argued that the physical things we see are just imperfect copies or participants in these true realities. It was his way of grounding knowledge and explaining the structure of the world.
A huge influential idea. But Aristotle, despite being Plato's student, wasn't fully sold on it.
Not at all. He had major criticisms. One big one is that the forms didn't really explain anything. They just sort of duplicated the problem. Now, you didn't just have to explain physical chairs. You also had to explain the eternal form of chairness and how the two related.
So it added another layer of things needing explanation.
That was Aristotle's view. He felt Plato hadn't really solved the problem of explaining change in reality, just shifted it.
And this dissatisfaction kind of motivates Aristotle's own project.
You could say that. You see, in the metaphysics, Aristotle is subtly making a case for something he thinks everyone before him largely missed or didn't emphasize enough: the final cause.
The purpose, the telos.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He believed understanding the purpose or inherent goal of things was crucial to understanding nature, and this becomes absolutely central to his own philosophy. He even sort of dismisses early philosophy as being like a baby just starting to talk full of babble, he says, because it hadn't grasped all four causes properly, especially the final one.
Full of babble. That's pretty harsh, but it definitely shows his perspective. Looking back at these early figures, though, it's so clear that our modern boxes, science, religion, philosophy, just didn't apply neatly back then.
Not at all. The lines were incredibly blurred. Think about it. The book of Genesis offers answers to questions about origins and purpose. You could maybe even map them onto the four causes, right? God as efficient cause, dust as material, God's image as formal, stewardship as final.
Yeah, you probably could.
But we wouldn't call Genesis philosophy in the same way we talk about Plato. It operates in a different framework, a religious one.
And conversely, some of the biggest hits from these early guys weren't strictly philosophy as we might define it now.
Absolutely. Pythagoras' theorem, that's mathematics. Thales predicting the eclipse, that's astronomy, a huge scientific achievement. They were advancing knowledge on multiple fronts.
So when did philosophy really start to look like philosophy as we often think of it, with Plato and Aristotle themselves?
Largely, yes. They really established the paradigm. They developed the methods, detailed arguments, conceptual analysis, systematic treatises, and raised the kinds of questions that philosophers have been debating ever since. Later thinkers saw themselves as heirs to Plato and Aristotle, using their tools, arguing with their ideas.
But even their work wasn't just pure philosophy by today's standards, right? They wrote about biology, politics, rhetoric.
Oh, completely. Their scope was vast. The point is, that whole period, starting in the 6th century BC in Greece, was this incredibly fertile time where religion, science, and philosophy were all tangled up together. They were part of the same cultural conversation.
And all three fields today can trace their roots back to that same tangled beginning.
Precisely. Whether you're a scientist, a theologian, or a philosopher, your intellectual ancestors are likely among these early Greek thinkers.
Okay, so just to wrap up our deep dive here, we saw the Milesians like Thales, Anaximenes, and Anaximenes really homing in on the material cause. What's the basic stuff?
Right. Water, the boundless apion, air. Different answers. Same fundamental question about matter.
Then the Pythagoreans shifted gears, focusing on the formal cause, the underlying mathematical structure, the numbers, the harmony they saw inspired by music.
A completely different approach, emphasizing pattern and form over substance.
And throughout this early period, the lines we draw now between science, religion, and philosophy were, well, pretty much non-existent. It was all part of the same quest for understanding.
Very much intertwined.
Then came Socrates, turning towards ethics, and Plato trying to synthesize it all with his theory of forms, which Aristotle then critiqued, paving the way for his own focus, especially on that often neglected final cause.
A progression, with each stage building on, reacting to, or refining what came before.
So maybe a final thought for you listening. Think about those four causes Aristotle laid out: material, efficient, formal, and final. As you try to understand things in the world, or maybe even your own life, which cause or why do you find yourself drawn to most often?
Which one feels most fundamental or most illuminating for you? Is it the stuff things are made of, the process that brings them about, the underlying pattern, or the ultimate purpose? It's a question that connects us directly back to these very first attempts to make sense of everything, something to chew on.